Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, evening, depending on where in the world you are. This is a session on digital tools for crop monitoring. We have an exciting session lined up for you here. We will be talking about how innovations in crop monitoring can unlock new applications for digital services for agriculture. And as we said in the introduction of the session, in the marketing or the promotion materials, we will be showing that here the sky might no longer be the limit. So we'll be presenting a case, an example of how crop monitoring can be done using smartphone images and remote sensing with different applications in advisories, in insurance, in agricultural credit. And with that, I will introduce myself. My name is Berber Kramer. I'm a senior research fellow with the International Food Policy Research Institute. I am leading a portfolio of work around the use of digital tools for crop monitoring and applications, different applications to services for smallholder farmers. I'm working closely with Subhransu, Pattnaik, who I will introduce in a bit, who will be presenting the main cases that we are studying and for which we are doing impact evaluations at the moment. In addition, we have in this panel Dr. Sanjay Mansabdar. He is the CEO and founder of Dvara E-Registry. Let me pull up his bio. So Dr. Sanjay Mansabdar is, as I mentioned, the CEO and founder of Dvara E-Registry. This is an award-winning agri-fintech that operates in 10 states in India. And Dvara E-Registry is working to ensure that smallholder farmers are able to access the business and financial products they need. Dvara's platform is called E-Registry. It reaches smallholder farmers by working with farm producer organizations or farm producer companies. Then it underwrites loans using a technology that they call CAT-Score, which is a satellite-based analytics package, and this connects eligible borrowers with lenders. We'll be talking more about that in this session. So that's Dr. Sanjay Mansabdar, who's one of our panelists. In addition, we will have Dr. Tim Foster. He's a senior lecturer in water food security in the Department of Mechanical, Aerospace and Civil Engineering at the University of Manchester in the UK. Tim Foster has over 10 years of experience working on agriculture water management and climate risk management in North America, Europe, Africa, and Asia. And his research uses crop models, earth observation, and economic analysis to understand and improve decision-making about land, water, and energy use in crop production. And he will be talking more about that work today. A third panelist is Kumar. Dr. Kumar is a senior scientist with the Borlaug Institute for South Asia, VISA, and CIMMYT. His research focuses on developing climate-resilient wheat cultivars with better nutrition and higher yield. He is leading the wheat program in VISA and works in close collaboration with national partners. He's using crop health monitoring. He's doing crop health monitoring using an aerial imaging system to reduce post-harvest losses and improve crop management practices. And he will be speaking more about an advisory component using crop images. And then finally, as I mentioned, our lead presenter for today is Subhransu Pattnaik. Subhransu is a research analyst with IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute in New Delhi. His research focuses on financial inclusion, climate resilient agriculture, and gender in agriculture. And he manages the research program that aims to strengthen agriculture insurance and credit in Odisha through what we call picture-based insurance, which uses smartphone images of targeted crops to monitor crop health and management. And Subhransu will be presenting several different cases of using smartphone images to improve crop health monitoring. So Subhransu, Over to you.
Hi, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon to all the participants joining this session. Um, to, before starting off about talking about the innovation and that and how we have used it in real life scenario in the context of India. Before that, I'd like to speak a bit more about like what inspired us to think about that innovation and what are the challenges that we thought we'll be addressing with the innovation that we are actually applying on the field. So in order to help the farmers, when we're talking about managing farmers' risk, so in order to help them in managing their risks, the service providers, let it be insurance underwriters, let it be credit providers or advisory service providers, or even the seed manufacturers. So they need to have a close eye on what is happening with the farmers on the field, and it has to be on a real-time basis. So, but at the same time, in-person monitoring is like quite resource-consuming and time-consuming as well. So the first potential solution to this problem would be with the advancement of the technology, we can think of satellite imagery. But it comes with its own challenges. The concept is also still coarse. It struggles with the cloud coverings and intercropping, etc. At the same time, for a farmer's point of view, it is very challenging, and the concept is very abstract of satellite imagery. And if we want to operationalize it in a efficient manner, we need to have expert image processors that we can use, and in the whole process, the whole task becomes very expensive, and we need to have a lot more resource than we could think of. So that's where our innovation become very instrumental. So remote access remote access for the service providers. It's not only going to monitor the activities on the field, but also be cost effective for all the service providers. So, for instance, for insurance providers, think of something like, what if the insurance provider can uh, do the loss assessment without having to send someone, like without having to send the loss assessors to the field. Similarly, for seed companies, with the remote access to the fields, they could actually observe the performance of the seeds in the real time situation under different environment and climatic conditions, and different farmers situations as well. So that would be a really good feedback for those seed producers as well. So it not only works from the for the service provider side, but also it's very help. It will be very helpful for the farmers' point of view as well, because farmers can get tailored advisories based on the images that we are using in this innovation. Moving on about the innovation. So the innovation is picture-based crop monitoring, which we are using in three different aspects, having the um, fundamental idea of observing and monitoring the crops in the field through smartphone images. So for the farmers, it's basically four simple steps that they need to follow. First, you download the application on your smartphone. And once the application is on your smartphone, you registered it through your phone number, and you start clicking the pictures from the date of sowing throughout the cropping season till the date of harvesting. So we do have an operational guideline about how we should be clicking the picture so that the images will be clear, so that we can assess it, and so that we can refer it back when we are using it for say in loss assessment or advisory or anything. So once the farmers start uploading the pictures in its smartphone, we do create a database. Um, specific to the farmers and specific to their crop or land. And eventually those can be used for monitoring, for advisory during the season, and for loss assessment at the end of the cropping season. So this is the innovation that we applied in our project locations where we are actually running evaluation right now. Talking about that, we have our presence in India, Kenya, and Ethiopia. But in today's concept, we are will be looking more in detail about the Indian context. So in India, we are working in 3 states, one in Haryana, Tamil Nadu, and Odisha. So in Haryana, the application of the picture-based monitoring is in the form of insurance. So we are using the pictures for retail insurance, crop insurance purpose. In Tamil Nadu, we are using it for picture-based advisory. And in Odisha, we are using it for picture-based microcredit for provide credit to smallholder farmers. In Kenya, for your brief idea, in Kenya, we have the partnership with Eker Africa, where we are bundling the insurance with stress tolerant seeds to manage to de-risk the investment of the farmers. And similarly in Ethiopia, we are working with R4. It's an a World Food Program initiative where we will be working to strengthen seasonal monitoring and reduce basis risk in their insurance product. Let's move on to the Indian context. So yeah, I mean, in India, loss assessment is a quite expensive affair, and from literature and from the case studies, we could actually found out there are some loopholes or the room for improvement for the national crop insurance scheme that is in place in India, that is also called PMFBY, Pradhan Mantri Dhan Nyan Yojana. So the I mean, in the Pradhan Mantri Fasal Bima Yojana, people there are some ideas that does not add up to people like farmers' expectations. So there is a growing mistrust among the farmers towards the PMFBY. So to address this challenge, our first application of picture-based monitoring was in the form of insurance. So in the last few years, we developed and tested a unique model for providing crop insurance to the users from the crowdsourcing images and help the insurance provider to see through the farmer's eyes. The seeing through the farmer's eyes was the initial concept that we started to work in India. So the application of picture-based crop insurance found to be an easier concept for farmers to understand, and it make the farmers more inclusive in the process, unlike of PMFBY. So the farmer engagement was there, and they do feel included in the whole process, and they feel that the process that they are being a part of it is going to lead something substantial when we are talking about minimizing the risk of the farmers. So the picture-based crop insurance can be used as a solution to the challenges of traditional indemnity-based insurance as well, where the administrative costs are too high and the supply is limited to smallholder farmers, along with the information asymmetry, such as moral hazard among the farmers. So from the randomized trial that we have been doing in Haryana, there are some interesting findings that we have published over the years in the academic circle. So I'll just run you through a quick interesting findings of what we found in terms of in the terms of Haryana context and picture-based insurance. So we found that picture-based monitoring helps in reducing the basis risk, and the loss assessed through pictures are found to be strongly correlated with yields and improve upon weather index-based measures. It also improves the willingness to pay for insurance significantly. I mean, if you compare the weather-based index insurance, and when you add PBI to the weather-based index insurance scheme, then the willingness to pay for the weather-based insurance plus picture-based insurance is higher than any of the product in isolation. So that is actually something really interesting to find out, that people, they do feel that PBI is adding value to their investment in terms of insurance. So what's next? Insurance, we implemented insurance in Haryana. So then we realized that the ground pictures could potentially be leveraged by other value-added services that can be beneficial for both farmers as well as the service providers. And it will help the value chain to a certain extent. So these ground images that the farmer sends through their smartphones, and we keep it as a database in our system, those ground images can complement like crop profile, soil data, weather data, and satellite images that will allow us deliver tailor-made advisory services to individual farmers depending on the crop, their land properties, and we can actually provide like um, specific instruction through advisory, which will be better for managing the risk for the crops of the farmers. So we applied this idea in the state of Tamil Nadu, where through a randomized trial. There also we did have good, like interesting findings. The work there was led by Dr. Berber, Kramer, and Dr. Francisco Ceballos, and one of our colleagues, Samyukta Kannan. So from there, we found out that on a simple knowledge test, farmers who received picture-based advisory performed significantly better than the control farmers where the intervention was not there. And even when focusing on content that was received by both sets of farmers, farmer who received the content to picture-based advisory, they performed better. And that suggests that the medium and the engagement of the farmers through the pictures actually mattered a lot. Another interesting finding that we found, that advisory complement insurance. So farmers receiving picture-based advisories are more likely to say that the advice helped them in minimizing risk compared to the people who received advisory in any other means other than picture-based. So providing insurance greatly improved farmer satisfaction in the advisory program, and actually encourage them to take more pictures and stay engaged in the program. So that is the second application of our innovation of monitoring the crops through smartphone imagery. Moving on to the next, it's how we used the same idea for agricultural microcredit. So this we implemented through a like formative evaluation in Odisha, where we applied it for for better access for the smallholder farmers, because we all are aware that how smallholder farmers often lack access to formal agricultural credit and from formal financial institution, and that leads that leads to not enough investment having been made into the agricultural practices by the farmers, and eventually it affects the profitability of the farmer. So the issue here is that the transaction costs are really high for issuing microcredit in this context, and there is information asymmetry among the farmers that is limiting the supply of agricultural credit. So for financial institution, it is expensive to screen and monitor the farmers who do not have access to credit, or they do not have any credit scores like we have. So more if we can say, people not having formal documentation are only falling behind getting the for financial agricultural credit in this context. So how we use that innovation here? We have the innovation called Kate Score, and that's why Mr. Sanjay Mansabdar is in the panel. He'll walk you through more in detail about how the Kate Score worked in favor of providing affordable microcredit to the farmers. So in the panel session, we'll talk more in detail about this. So I'll just leave it for now. Um, Moving on to the intervention that we have in Odisha. So we started a formative evaluation around innovation that aims to lower the cost of screening and monitoring of loans and expanding access to agricultural credit by doing credit scoring through Kate Score, which Sanjay will explain in detail. Um, and and we try to find out like how it is going to reduce the transaction cost and how we can overcome the information asymmetry and the documentation requirement in terms to get um, agricultural credit. So for this formative evaluation, we have 3,514 study participants from 58 villages in a district called Jajpur in the state of Odisha. Uh, we are actually entering the inline phase for this project, so we do have some interesting findings. And when talking about agricultural credit, I think there is one point we also need to make sure to address, that there is a gender disparity between like access to uh, agricultural microcredit. So there may be factors that limits women farmers than the men farmers to have access to those credit. So from the initial findings, we did found a strong gender gap in decision making around agricultural credit, when women were rarely having the final say, even if the agricultural credit has been taken on their name. So that is something we are trying to address, and more analysis and more conclusive evidence will follow after our inline evaluation there. But the interesting fact is that when we are talking about technology and we try to address that, we try to bridge that gap through technology, we did found that women reported more often than men that introduction of Kate score, which is the technical technology intervention, and bundling it with insurance would make them more likely to apply for loans, where in the baseline we found that they are not so interested in applying for loans. But in here, you can clearly see that once the technical component comes into the picture, it increases the probability of women applying for loans with a significant larger amount. So these are the three applications that we have made, that we applied in the context of India, in the state of Haryana for insurance, in the state of Tamil Nadu for advisory, and for microcredit in Odisha. So talking about the next steps, what more we can do with these innovations? So we are actually emphasizing now more on integrating different approaches, which will be again in all of our project locations. So we are actually going ahead to, see the effect of advisory as an alternative strategy for farmers, other than insurance as a risk mitigating tool, and agricultural practices and technology, how we can integrate them so that that will help us in further reducing the reducing the risk for the farmers. And also we are trying out some crop simulation approach, which Tim is going to go in more detail about it, so that I'll leave it to the panel session. Um, with that, we do have, with our presence, and we've been working for so long in the context of India, we do have some resources that um, you can find out by yourself. So in here, for the first two QR codes that we have provided here, you can go in there and check about like the labeled ground images that will be helpful for training and application in crop modeling. These are the training images that can be used for making if someone is working on developing a better crop simulation approach or crop modeling, then these are going to be really helpful. We are also working on a app that anyone can access and to spread the use of picture-based monitoring. So you can also go into that in the last two QR scanners and you can check it by yourself. So finally, before closing, I would like to thank all our donors who've been a great support for us throughout our journey in India as well as in other locations that we've been working. And that's it from my end. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Subhransu, for this really insightful talk. For anybody in the audience, if you have any questions on this presentation, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, and either we will answer questions live or presenters will respond by typing in answers. And that brings us to the panel. So we have, as I said, Dr. Sanjay Mansabdar, Dr. Tim Foster, and Dr. Uttam Kumar. Also, if you have any questions for the panelists, please type them in the chat. Let me kick it off asking some general questions to set the panel, starting with Sanjay. So Sanjay, can you tell us a little bit more about the credit model that Subhransu introduced, CAT-score, and potential applications, and how you're using smartphone images and satellites in this technology?
Right. First of all, thanks to the organizers. Thanks, Berber. Thanks to the panelists, Subhransu, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Coming to CAT-score, I think Subhransu framed the problem very well, which is really around, okay, more than 70% of, when you focus on small marginal farmers, more than 70% of them have never had access to formal credit, which, practically what does that mean? What if a lender wants to lend to them, where do they start? They've got no information whatsoever, right? And if you, credit is, as again, Subhransu pointed out, a key aspect or a key input into agriculture. And, frankly, if you can't get credit, that automatically means that you're exposed to several other risks. For example, in India, farmers would need to borrow from the input dealer, for example. And the way the input dealer typically asks for payment is in bags of produce, which has absolutely no bearing on price. And so not getting credit, in effect, leads to price risk for the farmer. Credit is a crucial part. And now if lenders do want to lend to farmers, then how do they solve this information symmetry? So they have no idea what the farmers are doing, what's the risk, what's the productivity. CAT-score is essentially an innovation to really meet this specific need. Of course, there are a few other things necessary to ensure that credit does reach the farmer finally, but this is a key aspect of it. Now, CAT-score essentially uses satellite data and image data in order to make these assessments, right? So now there are two parts to CAT-score. One is the historical assessment of what has happened, and the second is concurrent assessment, what's happening in the current season. And in the credit world, that broadly fits in with pre-loan disbursal and post-loan monitoring. Roughly, it fits those two buckets, the use case. Let me talk about the first case, which is really very briefly, how do you know what the farmer's done in the past? Now, you have to deal with several information gaps. You don't know what the farmer's grown in previous years. So really the model has to work on the basis, has to be fairly crop agnostic, otherwise it won't produce sensible results. And so really the parameters that we have chosen are really those that can make some assessments of cash flows. And ultimately all these parameters really have an impact on farmer cash flows, right? Productivity, I won't go into all of them, but the basic idea behind these is that we rate each one of these, except for area, we rate each one of these using a remote sensing index. And essentially then that combination, that we score based on the index, that score is then weighted up using a specific weightage, and I'll come to how we come to that weightage, and then we come up with a final score. I won't go into all the parameters. Let me just talk about one or two. Let's talk about productivity. Productivity essentially is how many crop cycles are there per year. In terms of trying to assess this, it's really simple. Look at NDVI cycles and essentially apply data science to figure out the cyclicality in the data coming from a specific land parcel, right? So the logic is fairly simple. If a farmer is growing 3 crop cycles per year, he's going to be able to support a higher loan. He's going to be able to, you also know that you can lend to him throughout the year. You also know that his field is irrigated, so the risks are lower, as compared to a farmer who's doing only 1 cycle per year, for instance, where it's rain-fed, it's likely to be not irrigated, which means the loan amounts that it can support are lower, which means that the loan can happen only during the rain-fed season, not during the off-season. So these are the kinds of interpretations that you can make. Let me talk about health. Health, again, we assess using essentially the NDVI values during a peak relative to history. And that's really how, so how well has it done in the past few cycles, past 3 years? That's really what we assess. That's how the way the weightages are calculated is really we've done a assessment. If a 1 point change in each one of these parameters, what is the percentage impact on cash flow? That's really the sensitivity that has been assessed, and these weightages have been arrived at through that back calculation. That's really K-score very quickly, but that's just the pre-disbursal. What happens post-disbursal? Banks want to know that the money has been used for sensible purposes. They want to know when the harvest date is likely to be. They want to know if there is a delay, then is the delay genuine, or is there some, is it an intent to not repay? These are things that banks want to know, or lenders want to know. That's where K-score now comes in. What happens is that we know what crop is being grown. Therefore, we have some kind of a signature for each crop. We can compare what's coming from the field, that signature, and make these assessments on what's the quality, what's the growth stage, what's the targeted harvest date, and so on. And typically, the way we enhance this is if there is a problem in any case, something is out, we typically use smartphone images in order to be able to verify what the problem is, so that we can find a solution for it, whether it is to a productivity issue or it's any other issue. We have information up front. The banker therefore has information up front. The banker knows, okay, this loan is likely to be delayed, this one is not. If this one is likely to be delayed, is it genuine? Is it a genuine case? And can we verify that it is indeed a genuine case? These are the kinds of assessments that are possible using K-score now. I'll take 1 more minute and I'll summarize very quickly what, this has been extremely successful. Just to give you a sense of numbers, KCC loans, Kisan Credit Card loans, which are the typical farmer loans that the banking system is supposed to produce in India. The repayment rate is, or the default rate is close to 15%. For us, the default rate at this point is less than 1%. That's been the impact of this. We've had more than 8 lenders sign up on the platform to participate on loans made using this technology. I'll close there for now.
Wonderful, thank you. That sounds like a really interesting model, Sanjay. Now the next panelist to make introductory remarks on one of the applications is Dr. Tim Foster. Tim, can you share us more? What is the value of crop monitoring in insurance applications? So we're moving to the world of insurance from credit now.
Yes, sure. Thanks, Berber, and also rest of the organizing team. I mean, to kind of start with a couple of background points that Subhransu has already nicely highlighted. For the context of insurance, one of the big challenges is around effective loss verification, particularly in kind of small-scale farming environments where you've got very large numbers of small-scale distributed farmers operating within a landscape. And if you want to go through the traditional approach of manually verifying losses in the field, that's going to be very time and labor intensive. At best, it's going to add costs and delay payouts. At worst, it's going to be completely infeasible. And so index insurance is a tool that's kind of emerged as a potential solution to that challenge. Basically a way of developing relationships between things you can more easily observe at scale, like weather conditions and crop vegetation conditions from satellite imagery, and yield outcomes at the field level. A key challenge, though, which Subhransu highlighted, is that building those relationships can actually be very hard to do reliably. So this is something that our work has been looking to try and tackle for an approach that basically tries to bring together the best of the scalable aspects of satellite remote sensing together with the biophysical predictive capabilities of crop simulation models. So basically how this approach works is we use crop simulation models to simulate a large kind of database of synthetic yield data that represents the range of management practices and field conditions and weather scenarios that we think occur in a given location that we're interested in designing an insurance product for. And then we use this data to develop relationships using data science methods like machine learning and also standard kind of parametric statistical techniques between stuff that we can observe in scalable satellite imagery and stuff that is also simulated directly by the crop simulation model. So leaf area index is one of our kind of key translation variables between those two tools, and we also look at using weather conditions as well. So we've applied this technique in a number of different contexts, but specifically to the insurance context, we've applied this and work in Eastern India for rice, and we've shown that this can actually be quite an effective tool for improving the accuracy of loss estimation and in turn reducing basis risk in insurance contracts, which has all these kind of benefits both for farmers in terms of getting more reliable payouts, but also for insurers in terms of them being able to offer potentially more affordable products that will have greater demand from farmers. I'd say that we've done this also probably we gave ourselves quite a hard time, and that we probably gave ourselves one of the harder crops and times of year to try and do this work, and that we did this for rice during the monsoon season. So it's encouraging for us that this approach works even in a system where actually the satellite images can be quite spotty at times because of cloud cover during the monsoon period. Related to this, the kind of a second kind of innovation of this work, in fact, so that I'd like to talk briefly about is that one of the things that we know just from basic agronomy, but also from the results that have fallen out of this work, is that the impacts of extreme weather events are obviously very dependent on when those events happen during the crop's growth cycle, and in particular in complex and heterogeneous farming environments, those growth stages, even where farmers are planting the same crop, can often vary a lot from one field to the next. That might be because farmers are planting at different times because of different choices around planting dates, differential access to labor availability. It might be differences in crop varieties with different maturity lengths that are being used by farmers. And this, again, poses a significant challenge to insurers, is that if we want to actually understand when losses are likely to occur, we need to really marry the timing over which we calculate our index to when those key growth stages are happening, but they're not happening at the same time in every location. So this is, again, an area where we've shown that we can use combinations of satellite remote sensing, but also the ground-based pictures that Subhransu highlighted as part of the picture-based insurance project, as well as basically as a way of ground truthing at the field or at the plot level when critical growth stages are happening. And this is really valuable in that it then effectively provides a mechanism for us to tailor the time period over which insurance indices that are used as the basis of payouts, whether that be kind of the leaf area index, or even just the simple kind of total of rainfall, temperature values, allows us to tailor those to the specific timing that the critical growth stage is happening on an individual farmer's field, where that critical growth stage and variable has in turn been informed by the crop simulation model approach. And again, the work that we've done in India has shown this can really be quite an important tool as a means of kind of reducing basis risk compared to the standard approaches used by insurers that effectively assume that all crops are growing at basically identical rates and identical times in every field across the landscape, which we know is in reality far from the truth. The final point I want to make just very briefly is, and this goes a little bit beyond monitoring and into kind of prediction, but also I think is relevant to some of the discussion we had, is that we also want to think about how we can design and use digital tools as a means of helping to design insurance contracts that also incentivize farmers to adopt other kind of risk-reducing management practices. And this is more of an emerging area of work in India, but also in Ethiopia, where we're looking to use crop models as a tool to quantify risk reduction benefits from different management practices, and then build those in to the pricing of insurance contracts to try and provide incentives for farmers to adopt those practices in return for more affordable insurance to cover them against other related sources of losses. And again, the monitoring aspect it becomes really important here, in that we need a scalable tool to verify and ensure that farmers are actually adopting the practices that they say that they're adopting when signing up for given contracts. And this is an area where we think that both satellite remote sensing, but perhaps more even the ground-based picture imagery, can play a really important role in strengthening that aspect of the monitoring and verification process. So those are the key points that I wanted to make to start off.
Okay, thank you, Tim. So you're saying that it's important, or that the smartphone images and satellite imagery can be used to monitor when crops are in which growth stage. That's important for insurance, because insurance should be active in the critical growth stages. But on top of that, I think really interesting is that you're saying, okay, with better crop monitoring, we can actually observe which farmers in a way are the safe drivers, just like our car insurance is rewarding us with lower premiums if we are the safe drivers. And so that is, I think that's a really interesting aspect. Maybe we can talk more about that also later on in the Q&A. Then our third panelist, Dr. Uttam Kumar, he will talk about a final application that Subhransu in his talk highlighted, and that is advisories. So we've talked about credit, insurance. Now let's get into advisories. Uttam, can you talk more about how smartphone images and technology are being used to provide better advisory services to farmers?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Borlaug. So first of all, I would like to thank you and the organizer for having this event. And especially again, thank you, to getting involved, let us say, breeders and people are working on the system to put, as a team member. Okay, so it's really interesting to learn a couple of things from this project, and especially from the this picture-based advisory. So first of all, I would like to again, I don't know whose idea it is that this KisanCam app, a picture-based advisory. This is one of the wonderful things so far I have seen, especially for the farmer. And I just want to make one comment. Basically, that's kind of my passion, and I belong to a basically rural farmer family. And until my post-graduation, I was working in the field. And what I see, especially through this project, especially through this picture-based insurance component, and especially on the advisory part through the pictures we are getting. So actually, I could relate. I can go back to like a couple of decades. When farmers in general has been given an advisory, so it was more limited to the weather-based advisory. Sometimes, like we get in the newspaper, okay, the shower is expected, the weather would be normal or below normal average this year. So that kind of very much generic advisory. So it was like overall good for the agriculture. But when you talk an individual farmer entity, and this was wonderfully mentioned by Subhransu and other colleagues also, as we know, we are not dealing with one set of farmer basically. Now we have different kind of farmers. Some are like small holding, large holding, medium, and even some of the farmers which are like landless farmer. So question is how we can address the issue of several type of farmer through these technologies. So anyway, I would be like more specific about the advisory component basically for this, and I would say the knowledge is the key. So like Kisan Cam app, it's a tool. No, there are some methodology also as we mentioned, but the knowledge. So what I see advisory, it's a kind of knowledge bank for the farmer basically, and these advisories are not only very generic, as I mentioned, all time they just announce the weather would be good or bad, and the next week it's expected to rain in that particular region. Not limited to that, but to be specific to the region, to the village, and to the specific farmer. I think that is important. Suppose I get a generic advisory. Okay, this time we are expecting, or maybe next we are expecting heavy rain. So suppose I'm growing rice, I have nothing to do with that advisory. But if I'm growing potato, of course, that advisory is very critical for me. Maybe I will not irrigate my plot because rain is expected. And I will tell you like honestly, this advice, I mean, I got engaged with this activity in 2017 only, and before that we were not much concerned about using that advisory even in our research trials. But what happened now, we are really taking care of all these kind of especially weather-based advisory. When we even irrigate our trials, we get that advisory from some sources and see whether we really need to irrigate or just wait a couple of days. These things are helping. So I'm telling as a scientist, but just think how important it would be for a farmer. Yeah. So anyway, there are two kind of advisory I mentioned. One is generic advisory, which goes to all the farmers, I mean, irrespective of the crop and type. Another is specific advisory. So we are in this project, through this technology, we are more focused on the specific advisories, which have the like key, we provide key benefit to the actual user, for example. And before this system was not in place, it was not possible to give a customized or individual advisory to the farmer. So now the wonderful idea is through the Kisan Cam app, we get the picture, and even farmer have the possibility to put their question mark, or they have some query. So our experts see the picture, see the text message, and they provide that kind of specific advisory. For example, there is a disease or pest infestation just beginning. So we can advise them in advance. Okay, we can see that kind of issue. Kindly take some preventive measures. Either it could be a preventive measures or it could be a kind of curative measures. But in both the cases, in the end, farmer get benefited. Rather than waiting kind of generic advisory either from the government side or from the university side, so it's already too late. Farmer lose something. So this is like one of the very important component, especially when we talk about how to have a climate resilient agriculture. So we are not talking about climate resilient variety. Of course, that's a separate subject, but talk about the climate smart or climate resilient agriculture. So this is one of the components that play a key role in to add value to that. Okay, and when we talk about the specific advisory, it's not only about to manage the crop, but it's important for some inputs also. Suppose there is a new variety. So frequently people are talking about some climate resilient varieties also. Like recently, Bill Gates have a like very interesting interview. So he also emphasized on the seed this time. And there are like several like issues going on about the food price in the world on that perspective. So it has been identified that the seed is one of the important components. So if there is a climate resilient variety, and let us say there are two type of farmer. One farmer is growing a newly developed climate resilient variety, another farmer is growing a traditional variety. So the farmer which is growing a traditional variety, he is more like prone to the climate risk rather than the farmer who is using a modern and climate resilient variety. So these kind of advisory are also being provided. These kind of partly not generic but not specific. That kind of advisory, and then Again, what I see basically from in last 2-3 years, my interpretation is, these advisories, special advisories, are really helping farmer to make some decision. For example, there is recently you might have heard in the news this rice, this how to say, instant rice, tall rice, and no one knows what is the cause for that. And farmer were looking here and there on Facebook, WhatsApp, and sometimes you see these kind of Facebook universities, they have a lot of false or like unauthentic information. So through these kind of system in place, we can provide very precise information to large number of farmers that certainly benefit them. So these are like some points that comes to my mind. And I mean, these advisory, as I mentioned, not only benefit country as a whole, as a village, district, state. These are benefiting farmers. That is the key point. And second, what I see through these whole exercises. So I mean, from a futuristic point of view, this technology seems to have a lot of potential. So I mean, if you ask me, I mean, about my level of satisfaction, what I'm doing, and whether you are getting some good response from the farmer or not. Of course, we have some indication, like Francisco had one publication where we saw that some positive impact of the advisory on the farmer, how they are adopting down the climate resilient varieties, adopting the climate resilient varieties or climate resilient practices. That is one thing, and this is already positive indication. Other than that, I see this technology has a huge potential to scale out, not only to different district, state, country, but not only at country. I foresee it like at least in whole South Asian level. I mean, for example, people are, some developed countries, they have a different kind of, cropping system or land holding. But I see like whole in South Asian, it's really a wonderful technology that I feel so far. And I don't know if further we can contribute from our side. I will be more than happy for that. So thank you very much, Berber.
Okay, thank you, Uttam, for sharing those insights, and great to hear that this is also in Haryana and with Bisa seen as a very promising technology, and that you have actually found impacts of it on farmers. For people who are joining us in this session, please feel free to put any questions that you have or comments for the panelists and for the presenter in the chat or in the Q&A. I will kind of kick off our round of questions and answers, which will be a bit faster than these introductory remarks by the panelists, with some questions for each of the panelists and the speaker. So my first question is, since this is the Asian Evaluation Week, I was wondering if you could all say a few things about, how do we evaluate the impacts of a new technology on farmers' livelihoods? And given that this is a technology-based intervention, and given the nature of your work, are we looking at, differences compared to the standard way that innovations or interventions are being evaluated? So is there anything different about this type of evaluations to be kept in mind compared to maybe more traditional evaluations of standard interventions that might involve, say, a randomized controlled trial between program and non-program communities? So who would like to take this question first? Who might have any thoughts on this and how to go about evaluating these types of interventions and what is currently happening? Perhaps we could start with Subhransu, since you're involved in one of the impact evaluations, like in the Odisha context. How are you going about the evaluation?
Thank you, Berber, for the question. I think the evaluations on this regard is going to be very state specific, and because in a large country like India, we do face a lot of differences between starting from agricultural practices, the nature of the farmers, the agroclimatic conditions. So in terms of when we are thinking of applying all these innovations in in a context of such a large country like India, it needs to be very context specific, and we do need to consider about what exactly is the situation or the stage of growth of the farmers in all in the country or in a given specific context. Other than that, when we are talking about thinking of drawing like underlying conclusion about how these technologies are going to have an impact or effect on the farmers, this is going to be something that we need to push it to the policy level. At least we do have some commonality between all the farmers in India, as well as the nature, the characteristics, and the management practices is being concerned. But at the same time, we also need to address the diversity of farmers throughout the country, and then only I think the evaluations that we are doing right now in the context of adopting technology for a climate resilient agriculture, then only it's going to be very inclusive for all the farmers we have in a context like India or South Asia, because the weather, the climate risks um, is a potential threat and is a major risk factor, along with the uh, socioeconomic background of farmers, very specific to Southeast Asia.
Okay, thank you. Sanjay, you mentioned that you have looked at the impacts of CAT score on repayment rates, and you mentioned that CAT score has higher repayment rates than the standard KCC loans. So there, of course, and a quick question is, okay, but maybe Dvara is doing the screening much more carefully over and beyond what the technology itself allows. So how are you thinking about, that type of question around, the comparison, if it is, a valid comparison, and to what extent is this because the difference that you find, to what extent is it because CAT score allows you to screen better versus having extra work in place to screen farmers in the context of a smaller scale operation than the traditional KCC loans?
Great question, Berber. And I think this is something, as a startup, and we deal with governments, we deal with research, we deal with venture capitalists, we deal with lenders. So there is evaluation of this going on at all points in time for us, one way or the other. And this question does come up very often. And really, honest answer, there's no one way to do this. One has to triangulate an answer, if I were to put it that way. So if you look at what are you evaluating? One, you're evaluating the technical innovation itself from a technology lens, really. That's item one. Item two, you're evaluating from an impact perspective. Sure, you're doing all this work, but does it really make a difference, right? That's number two. Third, can it be scaled? And these are the really three sort of evaluations this is under the lens all the time with these, with these three ways of looking at the same problem. Very difficult to, so coming back to your question very specifically, is it CAT score? Is it a bunch of other things? I know for sure it's not just CAT score, right? Because the problem is not just one. The problem is not just the idea that there's no information. There's a second problem which we solve as part of our solution, and we have to, right? Because otherwise we can't prove that it works, which is that there is a last mile need as well. Sure, banks may have the information, but how do they actually reach the end customers then, right? If they are to actually make these loans. So you have to solve both these problems simultaneously. Yeah, and that's really what we're doing. Now, when you solve the second problem, you'll end up putting in place some other things that are over and above the technology. So for example, in our case, there's product innovation. What kind of a loan should you give somebody, right? Or give a farmer, which is different from how KCC loans are given. Second is, what is the operational process to make sure that the collections happen on time and so on and so forth, which is again different from the KCC process. So is it crystal clear what's driving these low repayment rates? I would say no. But having said that, if you were to actually, like I said, look at it from multi-dimension or many different dimensions. So one is, of course, repayment rates, but that's one lens. A second lens is to simply say, okay, take the K-score idea and then look at the subcomponents. Say, okay, how are these working out? You say that if you look at crop cycles, it means greater cash flows. Can you prove this with data? So in that sense, you have to look at it, you have to break it down. But if you're trying to solve the social problem as a whole, there are many sub-problems, and the solution, unfortunately, does have to take all of them, has to solve for all of them simultaneously. So evaluation of a specific point becomes that much more difficult.
Right. No, that point is very well taken. On the same evaluation question, Tim, what we are often struggling with is in evaluating effects of technologies on resilience, or on, if the technology is robust to climatic events, or in the case of insurance, is insurance helping farmers in bad years. Our evaluations, in a way, need to wait for those bad years to happen. And when we're looking at, say, the effect of a technology on productivity in bad years, then we often don't have enough data to really test it. So there I was wondering how the crop simulation approach that you were using, how is that helping us answer some of these questions? What the impacts of certain technologies can be in bad years, even though we don't observe these bad years that often. Can you speak a little bit about your approach to evaluation of those types of questions?
Yes, I think that there's a couple of kind of areas of benefit for the approach in that regard. Firstly, I think often there's kind of an assumption that I think crop models kind of come in as a sort of a direct predictive tool for insurance, that they're designed to say on a specific field, given everything that we've observed happening in terms of weather and everything else, that this was the yield on that particular field. And when people have tried to do that, the approach often falls apart somewhat, because there's always things that you're missing, and there's always things that you don't observe, even down to the kind of the level of sort of micro scale weather variability. What they are really good at, though, is the ability to isolate the effects of specific conditions or specific management practices. So to say, if we assume everything else is held constant, a farmer, say, applies a certain amount of fertilizer, grows a certain variety, and we either adjust a certain weather event or we adjust a certain management practices, what does that do to our risk exposure? And that can kind of give some useful insights about what potentially the most useful levers might be to pull in terms of trying to reduce risk exposure. I think we've mostly been talking so far about kind of extreme weather events, but obviously the driver of increased extreme weather events is also climate change. And that also poses significant design challenges for insurance, in that our kind of contemporary distributions of extreme weather are not going to be the same as the distributions of extreme weather that we may see 10, 15, 20 years out into the future. And really the only way to tackle that problem is with more simulation-based approaches, where we can actually take predictions of future weather conditions or projections of future weather conditions and feed those into our models and look at how those affect risk exposure. And then in turn have a mechanism where we're being able to, say, continually update triggers and pricing of insurance products to account for the fact that we don't have stationary conditions in the thing that is the main driver of our risk exposure. On the crop simulation model side, I think that's two of the components. I mean, I think one additional thing to highlight on the remote sensing part, and this is perhaps not it's not solving an immediate need, but it's solving a long-term monitoring need, is a lot of impact evaluation, for obvious reasons, only tends to happen for a year, 2 years, maybe 3 years after an intervention. And then it often tends to stop unless there happens to be occasionally very long-term financing to continue checking how something's worked. That's something where remote sensing can then come in as a way of continuing to provide a mechanism to at least monitor some of the outcomes, for example, around agricultural productivity of an intervention forward in time over a longer time period to check are say resilience gains actually being sustained 5, 10, maybe even 15 years out into the future. And if not, can we detect when they're falling away and perhaps then trigger interventions to try and address that? Or if they are continuing to be maintained really well, maybe we can actually use that as a case that we want to go in and study in more detail to look at what are the factors that have enabled those interventions to be sustained over a long time period. So those, I think, are some of the ways that those two tools can help in these regards.
And really like addressing some data gaps, I hear. Staying on the evaluation question, within a slightly different context, for Uttam, in the context of Haryana advisories, can you tell us a little bit more about how you are measuring the impacts of these personalized, or what you call specific, advisories? Can you say a little bit more how you go about measuring those impacts?
So, well, that's very interesting question. And I think Subhransu mentioned at some point, or like agricultural conditions, especially, for the landless farmer, when loans are being applied mainly by the women, they have like single contribution, but still, in many cases they don't have the final say. So I would say that trend is still there. So, for example, when we contact the especially when the women farmers provide some advisory, so still it has to be done like implemented mainly from the male farmer. So sometimes it's really very hard to make a distinction whether the impact is being done is through the female farmer or through the male farmer. So I think we have to develop some kind of mechanism to study the impact on that. But in terms of delivery of like advisory, the channel is same. So because I mean, in many cases, especially our like female enumerators, they contact the women farmers, or the like, because they are the like household ladies, mostly working at home, as well as they are working in the field also. Irrespective of they are having dual role, but still I am not sure whether there is a direct impact can be measured, especially for the gender in this case. So difficult, at least for me to make that assessment. So, but anyway, irrespective of whether you contact what type of gender, the advisory seems to have a positive effect, and we are getting some kind of response, especially from the farmers. And how we judge whether we are getting some kind of response, like some positive feedback from the farmer or not. So what was happening earlier, advisory was kind of one way, but this kind of advisory kind of two way. You provide some advisory to the farmers and they get back to you. So if they are getting back to you, it means they are listening, they are paying attention. So this is, I can say, it's making some impact. That's to my understanding. Thank you.
Okay, and do you have villages where you are, that you have randomized to receive these personalized advisories, versus villages where you don't provide the personalized advisories, so that you can really compare outcomes between the two types of villages?
Yeah, I think that's one of the interesting. I think you need to make some kind of data analysis. Depends on the sorry, number of responses we get. Yeah, that's true. We have two different kind of groups where we provide specialized advisory, and we have another where we provide kind of generic advisory. So when we provide like generic advisory, So again, I think it has like less response from a specific gender. It's again common. So there could be some indication if you provide kind of specific advice to the farmer, because you are basically interacting with a particular farmer, whether it's a woman farmer or the male farmer. So, but that could be some distinction basically on that group, but still I have doubt, in terms of implementation point of view from the separating from the gender. So
I see. Yeah. So you're bringing up gender as well. On that, a question for Subhransu. I thought you had an interesting finding in your presentation, whereby you were showing that men are interested in larger size loans if they're offered traditional loans. But if you're introducing CAT score technology, that women increase the amounts of loans that they're interested in by more than men. And so it seems like introducing the digital technology in a way is reducing gender gaps in the demand for loans, with women and men now getting closer to one another. What are the implications of that finding for the program that you're looking at in Odisha?
Good question, Berber. Thanks for raising this point here. So often in the agricultural context, we do not necessarily think about the gender disaggregation in the labor force that is predominantly engaged in the agricultural activities. And if you look at in the Indian context, 70% of the agricultural farmers are female. And to be honest, amounts spent by the female farmers, often they're not called as female farmers because they belong to a agricultural household, but predominantly the male household is considered to be the main farmer for that household. But at the same point, if we look at the data, we find that there is not much difference between the male farmer of the household and the female farmer of the household. The amount of time they spend on the field. So what actually really a good interesting point to look at is at least through our evaluation that we are running, the randomized control trial that we are running, is that it's not about the exposure that the women farmer are getting for the agricultural credit, but it all comes down to what is the financial independence or the individual level independence of the female of the household towards the agricultural activities. So yeah, you rightly mentioned, like when we are talking about traditional credit system, the male farmer has always been in that arena, like going to the bank, applying for a loan, getting the loan back in their hand. So they know what the process, but in the gender norms, the existing gender norms, usually the female family member is not exposed to all those processes. So for them, getting out of their household activities and going for a loan application, that is something that they have not exclusively experienced during their agricultural activities that they get involved throughout the year, season by season. So when we introduce the technical component in there and we tell them that, okay, your application is going to be reviewed based on through a technical component. So for them, it is more like eliminating the time that they spend or that they first need to think about before going into a bank or any kind of financial institution. So when we are saying that technology is something that will enable you for getting the credit, I think the elimination of the procedure, the time consuming affair of going to the financial institution and getting used to the whole process, I think that reduces to a greater extent. And introduction of technology, that's why we see that difference when we introduce technology for enabling for providing credit. then the demand for credit is growing significantly for women than men. And exactly at that point, if in simplest terms, if we can make it available for the women farmers through technology, then I don't think there will be much difference between the men and women farmers in terms of credit that they demand.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, you were this finding was in the context actually of the TED School program. Let's also hear a bit from Sanjay how these types of findings like Dvara in terms of your operations.
Sure. So again, what lands up happening, there are multiple dimensions here to the same issue, as I said earlier, which is it's just the technology is largely agnostic to gender, right? However, it's a matter of how the product is delivered. It's being used for credit. So how is the overall credit product designed and delivered along with this technology? I think this is really where the differences start to, or we can take advantage of some of these findings. So I can mention 2-3 things that come to my mind immediately. The first, of course, is one of the key aspects that's different about how we do things, is partly the process. This is a doorstep loan that happens at the door of the family, rather than, as Subhransu mentioned, the family, the head of the household, or the lady having to run to the financial institution 10 times over to get the loan, right? Now, where does this start to make a difference? Many ways. First, there is a pitching process for the loan, right? Now, what we find typically is that the participation of women in this pitching process is much higher. As Subhransu mentioned, the actual cultivator is the woman in many cases, right? And certainly contributing a large part to it. There is a significant participation from women because it's not, they don't have to go some different place, or they don't have to be in the field specifically at a specific time. Similarly, when it comes to now the role of women in microfinance is pretty well understood, right? What we found is that we've started to include them in loan applications for individual loans as well. Now, this is not the case for farm loans in the past. So in that sense, the number of women applicants who are primary applicants is way higher for our program, for instance, as compared to, say, KCC. Number 2. A third really is in loan repayments. Now, if you think about once the lady the house is actually involved in the decision making, in deciding what the loan quantum ought to be, what the monthly repayment is, there's that much more engagement, because when the loan agent comes around for collections, the person typically at home is the lady of the house, right? So in that sense, the engagement around repayment is that much higher, as a third example. A fourth example is really around, when we set this up, it's not just for farm loans, right? This infrastructure is usable for multiple kinds of financial product as well. Insurance is another one. A third one that we've actually implemented this year is gold. Yeah, and it turns out that the decision makers with respect to, and we're doing this only with the farmers where we've actually done farm loans in the past. Yeah, those are the ones we're going to for gold product. It turns out that women are the biggest decision makers with respect to gold. So I would say it's an adjacency, but it's what the process is building. In that sense, women are getting the ability and the products and to be able to make some of these decisions at least independently, but certainly have a far larger say in what is the exact loan that gets taken, what its terms are, and as I mentioned, other adjacencies.
That's interesting. Thank you. And I think an interesting example of a collaboration between researchers and a startup in the fintech space. A final question on the gender theme for Tim. Tim, although you're doing crop simulations, which are very technical, I assume, and maybe not necessarily directly seem to have room for gender, is there a role for gender in your work? And how are you looking at it in the context of your crop simulations?
So yeah, I mean, you're right in a way that crop model is agnostic to gender. There isn't a button that we can press that sort of says whether it's a male or a female farmer. So I guess the role of gender really comes into how, for a given, if we're evaluating, say, differences between male and female farmers, how we're specifying things like management practices, varietal choices, things like that as inputs to the model. And that might be differences in kind of types of crop variety used, it might be differences in the amount of inputs used, or it might be a bit more subtle than that, and it might be, for example, the timing of when inputs are used. So it may be that certain groups of farmers, whether that's male or female or different groups in society, are able to access the same amount of inputs, but have delays in when they can access them, and that maybe leads to those inputs being applied later than they should be during the growing season. And that's something that we can use models as a way of assessing what the potential implications of that might be for risk exposure. Obviously, sometimes we don't always observe very clear differences between male and female farmers, as Subhransu's highlighted, that we're finding in some of the work in Eastern India in terms of kind of quantities of input usage. So in this case, some of the differences may come in the costs of purchasing and accessing those inputs, and then it's less a direct input to the simulation approach and more about how those simulation data are layered into a broader exercise of understanding farm profitability and farm budgets for different farmers. Obviously, if you're paying more for each unit of irrigation, then the actual kind of benefit in terms of your income and profitability is going to be lower if you're still getting the same yield benefit.
Okay, thank you. I see we have an audience that is either a bit quiet because the messages are clear, or it's kind of a challenging area to come up with comments or questions. So I don't see further at the moment quite Q&A or comments in the Q&A. If there are any, feel free to type in. Otherwise, I propose we start rounding up. Maybe I can give the floor to each of our 4 panelists to give in one sentence, really short, the key message that you would like on this theme to relate to the audience. Let's start with Sanjay. Sorry for putting you on the spot, being the first one. But what is, if people are walking away, what is the key thing that you would like the audience to remember or to walk away with from issues relating to this theme, using technology for crop monitoring and different applications in finance and advice?
Sure. So I think, honestly, the key is related to actually the evaluation itself, right? Which is, this is not going to be successful, or use of tech is not going to be successful if people don't believe it will work, right? And ultimately, to do that has several dimensions. One, of course, your question was spot on, was how do you actually prove it, right? Because there are multiple things going on. And that is a topical issue. That's one. The second really is around trying to keep it simple, because with tech, you can go overboard, absolutely overboard. You have to keep it understandable, is really what is sort of one of the things that I say. So particularly in this area, you can do a million things with it, but then you're stuck with a million problems of proving that it works as well. So I would say keep it simple. If you can, you'll be able to prove it better and you'll be able to scale it.
All right, great. Keep it simple. Uttam, what is the one key takeaway message that you would like to relay? And we can keep it short.
Thank you, Berber. So as a key takeaway message, so I think being on the economic side of the analysis and the evaluation and the work on the gender that we are doing, So these kind of evaluations are certainly will be helpful in defining the disparities among the male and female agricultural labor force. And when we are talking about technology bringing into these kind of evaluation, we have some proof of concept that it certainly helps. But again, there are a lot of factors that also account for to what level we are going to make it a successful one. So for me, the key takeout messages will be definitely technology is enabling irrespective of gender. I mean, it is more empowering for the female, and it will certainly take the female labor participation in agricultural activities to such an extent where equal opportunities will be there for both male and female farmers.
Okay, thank you. So key message is on the gender side and the potential of these technologies to reduce gender gaps and empower women. Very good. Uttam, we lost you. So let's try again, and hopefully this time the internet connection sustains.
So my Zoom was exit unexpectedly. Anyway, so my key message is, through this intervention, we are making life of farmers, agriculture support system, government and policymaker easy.
Okay, good. So we're making things easy. That's good. I hear keep it simple and make things easy through technology for our end users. Finally, last but not least, Tim, what would be your key takeaway message?
Key takeaway message would be, I think, within these kind of landscapes that we're working in, so particularly in the context of Asian farming systems, there's no one sort of standard farmer. Every farmer in every field is different, and I think that's really the place where digital tools such as remote sensing, ground-based imagery, crop modeling can help to better design and target interventions and tools to reflect that heterogeneity.
So that is interesting. Thank you. So I hear on the one hand, we want to keep things simple. The tools are making it easier for the end users. And that despite a lot of heterogeneity in farmers is highlighted by Subhransu, the potential to empower women, and as highlighted by Tim, we have all this diversity, but the digital tools in a very simple way can actually help address that diversity. So that would be my way of synthesizing the key messages from our full panelists. Maybe with that, let's come to an end of this session. I would like to thank our full panelists for taking the time to share their insights with us. So thank you, Subhransu, Sanjay, Uttam, and Tim. Also, thank you to the organizers for having us here, and thank you to the audience for joining us today. And in case of any questions, please do not hesitate and get in touch with us. Thank you.